Namaskar students, today we'll be moving into lecture 26. This is on the theories of IR. We will be moving to the International Political Economy School. We will be doing first the classical theories and then we will go into the modern school where the other modern theories of international political economy we can do. So first in this lecture, we will be generally explaining to you what are the classical theories, and we will try to study what is called the first school of mercantilism, right? So we will move ahead into this school. Now, the first question that anybody asks is, please understand that in international relations, you cannot compartmentalize and just study one aspect of it, whether it's only political or only social. We will have to, please understand, international relations by itself is an interdisciplinary subject. And though there is the primacy of the political, and hence it is placed on the political science. But one has to understand that economics is a very important issue of power. What money is to economics, power is to politics. And wherever there is money, there is power. And wherever there is power, there is money. So any theoretician of international relations will have to have some understanding of the international political economy. And hence, it is very important as students of international relations that you also understand the subject. Let us see what are the definitions we have. One that has been given by Gilpin, the reciprocal and dynamic interaction in international relations of the pursuit of wealth and the pursuit of power. The two issues, pursuit of wealth and pursuit of power. Keohane says, the interaction of the substantive area studied by economics, production and exchange of marketable means of want satisfaction, with the process by which power is exercised, that is central to politics. Keohane says it's the connection between economics and politics beyond the confines of a single state. Now, Robert Gilpin. This is Robert Gilpin. Most of you should know. He was a scholar of international political economy and a professor of emeritus of politics and international affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. He held the Eisenhower Professorship as well. Gilpin specialized in political economy and international relations, especially the effect of multinational corporations on state autonomy. This is a very important issue because please remember, in the present US elections, one of the main issues that is being contested is the role of big tech. Big technological giants like Facebook, Twitter, Google, and others, because these are unaccountable and they're not transparent. But at the same time, they can control what you should know and what you should not know. When information and knowledge is power, it is turning to what Foucault was telling us, that power is knowledge, meaning they decide what you should know and what you should not. And there has been a huge hue and cry over many of these platforms because they have been censoring certain people and not certain other people. That is, they have been supporting a particular ideology. How dangerous it is to a democracy is extremely important. And most of you know this has been one of the issues of the present US elections. Trade is, he said, is the oldest and most important economic nexus among nations. Indeed, trade along with war has been central to the evolution of international relations. This is the second and one of my favorite, that is Susan Strange. She was a British scholar of international relations who almost single-handedly is responsible for creating the school called International Political Economy. She is the one who said that those economists who don't understand politics are no economists, and those political scientists who don't understand economic issues are no political scientists. She said it is very important for economics to understand the power structure. And it is very important for people in politics who want to study power to know where the money goes and who gets it, when, where, and how, and why. Like Harold Lasswell asked the question. Her notable publications, she taught at the London School of Economics and Politics. Her notable publications include Casino Capitalism, States and Markets, The Retreat of the State, and Mad Money. She is known as a pioneer of international political economy as we study it today in international relations. She played a central role in developing the subject as a field of study in Britain. She claimed that in general, economists simply do not understand how the global economy works due to poor understanding of power and over-reliance on abstract economic models. Because she says this whole mathematization and statistics that has come into econometrics just does not work in real life. However, she noted that political scientists also have a woeful understanding of international economics because due to their emphasis on institutions and power. Thus, when she became one of the strongest campaigners advocating the necessity of studying both politics and economics for international relations, scholars. International political economy. IR scholars committed the misunderstanding of separating economics and politics. For a long time, economics and politics in IR were seen as almost totally isolated with each other, as qualitatively different activities being studied qualitatively with different approaches. In the early 1970s, this separation and mutual neglect was questioned. States and Markets, 1988, delineates 4 key channels that constitute power: security, production, finance, and knowledge. Power is the ability to provide protection, make things, obtain access to credit, and develop and control authoritative modes of interpreting the world. Susan Strange posits that the most overlooked channel of power is financial access, which consequently becomes the most important one to comprehend. In other words, she argues that one cannot comprehend how the world works without a thorough understanding of international financial markets. Her book, called The States and Markets, her analysis focused on what she called the market authority nexus, the seesaw of power between market and the political authority. She maintained that global market relative to the nation state had gained significant power since the 1970s and that a dangerous gap was emerging between the two. She considered nation states inflexible, limited by territorial boundaries in a world of fragile intergovernmental cooperation. She called it Westphalia, is what she called Westphalia. Markets would be able to flout regulations and reign free, creating more uncertainty and risk in an already chaotic environment. Casino Capitalism. To illustrate casino capitalism, published in 1986, discusses the danger of the international financial system, which was considered confirmed by the 1997 Asian financial crisis. In this book, she defined casino capitalism as a form of capitalism that is extremely volatile and unpredictable as a consequence of speculatively oriented lifts in financial capital. There is a financial contagion creating a huge instability in the international financial markets. In Casino Capitalism, Susan Strange problematizes the non-system that the international monetary system has become. She compares it with a casino wherein the foreign exchange plays as snakes and ladders. She sets the stakes that international finance has become stronger than states and has been deregularized. So basically her whole argument in the casino capitalism is basically one day you can lose all your savings like you do it when you're playing a poker game or you're playing something in the casino. Or suddenly you can have a windfall. And for this you don't have to do anything. It is the system that does this which is so unpredictable. Bretton Woods system. Most of you know that the international political economy post Second World War took a certain, trajectory. And it is important for us to understand what the trajectory is. And for that, we have to understand what is this Bretton Woods system, agreement and system, which was created, collective international currency exchange that lasted from the mid-1940s to the early 1970s. See, the Bretton Woods system required a currency pegged to the US dollar, which was in turn pegged to the price of gold. The Bretton Woods system of monetary management established the rules of commercial and financial relations among the United States, Canada, Western European countries, Australia, and Japan after the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. The Bretton Woods The Bretton Woods system was the first example of a fully negotiated monetary order intended to govern monetary relations among independent states. The chief features of the Bretton Woods system were an obligation for each country to adopt a monetary policy that maintained its external exchange rates within 1% by tying its currency to gold, and the ability of the International Monetary Fund to bridge temporary imbalances of payments. So the Bretton Woods system was preparing to rebuild the international economic system while World War II was still raging. 730 delegates from 44 allied countries gathered at Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, United States, for the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, also known as the Bretton Woods Conference. The delegates deliberated during 1 to 22 July 1944 and signed the Bretton Woods Agreement on its final day. Setting up a system of rules and institutions and procedures to regulate international monetary funds, these accords established the three pillars of what we call this, that is the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which today is part of the World Bank Group, and then the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. The United States, which controlled 2/3 of the world's gold, insisted that the Bretton Woods system rest both on gold and the US dollar. The Soviet representatives attended the conference, but later declined to ratify the final agreements, charging that the institutions they had created were branches of Wall Street. These organizations became operational in 1945 after a sufficient number of countries had ratified the agreement. On 15th August 1971, the United States unilaterally terminated convertibility of the US dollar to gold, effectively bringing the Bretton Woods system to an end and rendering the dollar a fiat currency. At the same time, many fixed currencies such as the pound sterling also became free floating, meaning what happened earlier, 1 ounce of gold was equal to $1. Now with the American economy declining, the Americans did not want to anyway be the international guarantor. So when they decided not to give up their position as the international guarantor, then came a problem. That is why you have gold rates going up or fluctuating with the international monetary uncertainties. So if you see very clear, after 1971, the price of gold started skyrocketing. Reasons for the crisis. The US was in economic difficulties and because of its deep involvement in the Vietnam War, 1961 to 73. To halt the drain on US gold reserves, the gold convertibility of the American dollar had to be abandoned. Political measures were taken that changed the rules of the game for the economic marketplace. After hegemony, meaning many people like Keohane wrote this book saying that, okay, now the economic hegemony of the US is over. Then how do you have an international economic system without a guarantor? The oil crisis from 1973 onwards contributed to a sense of lost invulnerability. In times of economic crisis, it usually becomes clearer that politics and economics hang together. Decolonization had created a new group of politically weak and economically poor states in the international system. This satisfied them with a subordinate position in the international economic system. 1978 called for the new international economic order by the non-aligned movement. Most of you should know that the bipolar order was not a tight bipolar order. It is what we call a loose bipolar order, meaning that you had two big major groups, that is one led by the United States of America and the other led by the Soviet Union. And you had a third group of countries which did not want to join either of the two blocs, and they were called the non-aligned countries. In 1973, they called for the new international economic order, political proposals designed to improve the position of the third world. First world was the Western democratic world, the second world was the communist world, and the third world was of these newly independent post-colonial states which did not want to align with either of the two blocs. John Ebb Hobson, it is really the period from the World War II to the 1960s that makes up the historical exception. This was the period when the Cold War and the relatively low level of international economic integration made it meaningful to maintain a pure focus on international relations as high politics. The return of the modern international political economy, arisen in the 1970s, focused on the interactions between politics and economics before World War II. Complex interdependence. Keohane and Nye brought about a book by this name in 1977. It called for an intensification of international economic ties of mutual exchange and mutual dependence. The 1970s do not mark the birth of international political economy, but rather its institutionalization. The summary here, if we say till now, what were we trying to say? First issue is there's a complex relationship between politics and economics. And it is very important that all students of international relations understand this complex relationship between states and markets, between power and money, IEP or International Political Economy tries to look at this complex relationship. So you have understood in this whole school, what are we trying to look at? We are trying to look at the important complex relationship between politics and economics, between states and markets, between money and power. Now we will move into the first school of international political economy, and we call it mercantilism. This theory is intimately connected to the establishment of modern sovereign state during the 16th and 17th centuries. It was the worldview of political elites that were at the forefront of building the modern state. Economic activity is and should be subordinate to the primary goal of building a strong state. So economics became an important instrument for political power. They see the international economy as an arena of conflict between opposing national interests rather than an area of cooperation and mutual gain. Economic competition between states is a zero-sum game, where one state's gain is another state's loss. States have to be worried about relative economic gain because the material wealth accumulated by one state can serve as a basis of military political power, which can be used against other states. This is the issue, please understand, that has come out during the COVID crisis, where you have China trying to use the COVID crisis to blackmail, excuse me, most of the states. Even India, you know that they tried at Galwan, then at Ladakh, and we have had a lot of skirmishes on the border. So the question that is being raised by the mercantile school is extraordinarily relevant. Similarly, in thinking with the neorealists about competition between states in an anarchic realm. Mercantilism has two forms. Economic rivalry between states can take two different forms. One, defensive or benign mercantilism. States look after their national economic interest because that is an important ingredient of their national security. Two, aggressive or malevolent mercantilism. States attempt to exploit the international economy through expansionary policies, like, for example, colonialism in Asia and Africa. They see economic strength supports the development of the state's military and political power. Military political power enhances and strengthens the state's economic power. Wealth and power can be pursued simultaneously in mutual support. More national wealth and more military political power are complementary stratagems that serve the same fundamental end, a stronger and a more powerful state. So the mercantilists see economy or economic power or strength in relation to a powerful state. Evolution of mercantilism. 16th century, Spain benefited from the support and silver from the Americas and the call for the bullion as the main road to national wealth. 17th century, Netherlands emerged as a leading country in Europe because of its vast overseas trading empire, emphasized trade and the creation of the largest trade surplus as the road to national prosperity. 18th and 19th century, you see Britain obtained a leading role in world politics through industrialization. Countries need to industrialize as the best way to national power. The catching up could not be left to market forces. It called for political measures to protect and develop local industry. Advocates of mercantilism. Alexander Hamilton, 1757 to 1804, was an American statesman, politician, legal scholar, military commander, lawyer and banker, and economist. He is one of the founding fathers of the United States of America. He was an influential interpreter and promoter of the US Constitution as well as the founder of the nation's financial system, the Federalist Party, the United States Coast Guard, and the New York Post newspaper. The New York Post paper became very famous recently during the American elections because they brought out the issue of the Biden laptop, Hunter Biden's laptop. Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton was the main author of the economic policies of George Washington's administration, the first President of the United States of America. He took the lead in the federal government's funding of the state's debts, as well as establishing the nation's first two de facto central banks, the Bank of America and the First Bank of the United States, a system of tariffs and a friendly trade relations with Britain. His vision indeed of a strong central government led by a vigorous executive branch, a strong commercial economy, government-controlled banks, support for manufacturing, and a strong military. The other main thinker we have is the German American economist called Friedrich List. Friedrich List, 1789 to 1846, who developed what is called the national system of political economy. He was a forefather of the German Historical School of Economics and argued for the German customs union from a nationalist standpoint. He advocated imposing tariffs on imported goods while supporting free trade of domestic goods, and stated the cost of a tariff should be seen as an investment in the nation's future productivity. List of principal books is the the National System of Political Economy, which he wrote in 1841. Contemporary relevance. Friedrich List's protectionist theories were probably the most influential of the modern era, even if they become marginalized in the academic and public sphere until relatively recently. Bits of List's theories do turn up in mainstream economics, most significantly his concept of infant manufacturers industries, a polity seeks to develop through preferential treatment. Within this concept rests the essential flaw of protectionism. It's impossible to favor a particular industry in a way that financially benefits 100% of the nation. Tariffs beggar the entire population for the benefit of a few. List's ideas. List's answer was, a tailor is no nation and a nation no tailor. Meaning, nationality and national interest continue to exist even if you ignore them. A developed economy is manifestly, this is very important, see these ideas have become very relevant because of the changes and the issues that President Trump has been raising throughout the elections and against globalization, and he has promised to make America the manufacturing hub of the world again. A developed economy is manifestly preferable to an economy of raw materials and services. Laws that restrict international trade in slaves, forbid importation of hazardous materials, and prohibit business with the king's enemies are uncontroversial. And the benefits of developing the communal, educational, technological, and popular support for advanced industry, a balance of harmony of productive powers outweigh the costs in measurable business activity. List's best-known work, The National System of Political Economy, is supported by ancient and modern examples. An argument runs through the book that 19th century England, having built the world's preeminent economy through relentless and innovative mercantile tactics, was engaging in a great shuck or to convince the rest of the world that Britain's wealth was created in spite of that system and not in consequence of it. Only where the interest of individuals has been subordinated to those of the nation, List wrote, and where successive generations have striven for one and the same object, the nations have been brought to harmonious development of their productive powers. Hamilton and List. Let's look at their contribution and how they are relevant even today. Hamilton was a strong proponent in the form of protectionist policies and promoting domestic industry in the US. List in the 1840s developed a theory of productive power, which stressed the ability to produce is more important than the result of producing. Prosperity of a state depends not primarily on its store of wealth, but on the extent to which it has developed its powers of production. A nation capable of developing manufacturing power, if it makes use of the system of protection that has quite in the same spirit as the landed proprietor did, who by the sacrifice of some material wealth allowed for some of his children to learn a protection trade. Recent mercantilists focus on the successful developmental states in East Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China. They emphasize the economic success has always been accompanied by a strong, commanding role for the state in promoting economic development, the return and the transformation of the state. The Japanese state has played a very comprehensive role in economic development. The state has singled out strategic industries, protected them from outside competition, and supported the development even by regulating the competition between firms. Now, summary. How we look at the mercantile school totally, and what are the issues we raised and how is it relevant today? Mercantilism posits the economy as subordinate to politics and particularly to government. So economic activity is an instrument of a country's political and foreign policy. Economic activity is seen in the larger context of increasing state power. The organization that is responsible for defending and advancing the national interest, namely the state, rules over private economic interests. Wealth and power are complementary, not competing goals. Economic dependence on other states should be avoided as far as possible. When economic and security interests clash, security interests have the priority. So the mercantile school makes it very clear. And here we have given you a summary. Relation between politics and economics. Politics is decisive. Main actors, units of analysis, states. The nature of economic relations, conflictual, a zero-sum game. Economic goals, stay at power. So if you have seen very clearly, we have done the first school of the international political economy, classical theories, mercantilism. In the next lecture, we will move on to the second school. Thank you so much, students.